And we're getting into Saul's reign over Israel. Looking at him there. So even before Saul, we're trying to work our way up through Scripture, of course. And this particular section is going to end around 1 Kings chapter 10. But even before Saul was anointed as the first king of Israel, biblical inspiration, it signaled some trouble ahead, right? Saul, he was unaware, actually, of Samuel and the nature of his work. And he had to be enlightened. They had to tell him who this guy was. If you look over at 1 Samuel chapter 9, 1 Samuel chapter 9, for example, in verse 6, he said to him, behold, talking to Saul, he said to him, behold, now there is a man of God in this city, and the man is held in honor. All that he says surely comes true. Now let us go there. Perhaps he can tell us about our journey on which we have set out. And so, because remember, one of the tests of a prophet or false prophet is if the people said something, right? Or if this person said that they spoke for God, and it didn't come to pass, then first, the people weren't supposed to be afraid of that individual, but then second is that individual was supposed to be stoned. And so, in telling Saul about Samuel, it's not only important that he speaks of his reputation, but that he's very clear in saying, this man of God, what he says comes to pass. And so we know that he's not a false prophet. We know and understand that he's not a false teacher. So when Saul finally meets Samuel, he's unaware that it was Samuel to whom he was speaking. He hadn't met the guy before. He had only heard about him. Almost, we can liken this to Ananias and Paul in the New Testament. You remember Paul, when he's on the road to Damascus to persecute the church, and he meets the Lord on the way, and he's in this house on a street, and he's fasting, and he's praying, and the Lord appears to Ananias, and he's talking to him about Paul. And what does Ananias say? Look, I've heard about this guy, how he's never met him before. So it's similar in that Saul, he's never met Samuel either. He's just heard by reputation. And so when he finally does meet him, he doesn't know who he's talking to. And the only kind of full bright spot in Saul's reign, because Saul had some problems, right? I think we could agree on that there. The only real big looming bright spot is his first military victory. And look over in 1 Samuel 11, for example. And the reason that it's a big bright spot, him defeating the Ammonites, is because he gave God the glory for his conquests. And that's, he didn't try to take credit for it. He gave God the glory, and he didn't try to take vengeance on those who had rejected his rule over Israel. Saul's heart was revealed early in his reign. Following the these three signs of confirmations of Paul's appointment in being king, Samuel instructed Saul to wait 7 days. When he got to Gilgal, he was to wait there for 7 days. For his arrival to offer sacrifices to God, even though you've got to go back just a page or two in 1 Samuel 10 and verse 8. You shall go down before me to Gilgal, and behold, I will come down to you to offer burnt offerings and sacrifice peace offerings. You shall wait 7 days until I come to you and show you what you should do. So, but before the close of the 7th day, Saul, unfortunately, he started walking by fear instead of by faith. And what that meant is that Saul, just instead of waiting those 7 days for Samuel to arrive and to make those sacrifices, Saul, in his fear, he begins to offer the sacrifices himself. In Samuel's absence, Saul takes up the reins there. In 1 Samuel 13, verses 8 and 9. He waited 7 days according to the appointed time set by Samuel, but Samuel did not come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering from him. So Saul said, "Bring me the burnt offerings and the peace offerings," and he offered the burnt offerings. So there was a time there, but and Saul became fearful. It was, things aren't happening on my time. Did he pray to God to see what had happened? No. It was that people started to leave him, and he started to compromise. Now, one of the things that we're trying to do is to connect historical events to New Testament living, New Testament Christianity, if you will, and how we might be compared to this. We are often, we say wait on the Lord, right? The Lord will deliver, the Lord will give the increase, whatever verbiage we want to use. And then sometimes people, for whatever reason, because maybe the congregation's not growing fast enough or what have you, and this is all congregations pretty much, is what do they start to do? They start looking elsewhere. They start, instead of waiting on God, they become like Saul, they become afraid, and they try to take matters into their own hands, and they say, well, I'm just going to leave. And then those that are remaining there, they become afraid because people are leaving. They're scattering from them. And so what do? They start to compromise. They start to take matters into their own hands, and they start to compromise. And the compromise, it could be a variety of things. It could be, okay, we're going to start having a band up there playing, or we're going to start having women doing the preaching, or whatever it might be. But it's because they're afraid that they end up becoming progressive instead of waiting on God. And that was the issue here. The action, so Saul making these sacrifices had barely been completed, and then Samuel arrived on the scene and he confronted Saul with his sin. 1 Samuel 13, verses 13 and 14. Samuel said to Saul, "You have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord your God, which he commanded you. For now the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart." We know who that's going to be, right? David. "And the Lord has appointed him as ruler over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you." Now in the New Testament, we might liken this to the book of Revelation and the candlestick being removed. It's because you didn't wait on God, because you were fearful, because you compromised yourself, because you started going against commandments that God has set down. God's going to give the increase elsewhere. We might look at it that way. And so by this one act of disobedience, Saul, he had demonstrated his willingness to displace God's will with his own. This one instance, this one act of disobedience, that shows where Saul's heart really is. God's commandment to wait 7 days was a test of Saul's faith. It was a test of Saul's love for God. It was a test of his commitment toward God. And yet he failed on all of them. He failed the test. And he adopted that kind of self-willed spirit that proved to ruin Israel. That was during the time of the judges. You remember is that God had given commandments, and people did them for a little bit, and so then they sinned, and then punishment came, the judge came, and they repented, and we all know the cycle there. David sinned as well, but the thing with David and the difference is that David, he immersed his sin in deep repentance. And his heart truly was changed. He threw himself on the mercy of God, something Saul did not do. And we've talked about that before, even the difference between David and Judas, for example, is that David had a repentant heart. He asked for grace, he asked for mercy, he asked for forgiveness. He threw himself, before the judge. It was kind of like, Your Honor, have mercy on me. I want the mercy of the court. Whereas Judas went out and hung himself. And so, yes, David sinned. David made mistakes. But he was grieved by his sin. And, Saul, he never dealt with his sin in that way. Saul, realistically, he had a heart problem. And, it says there in 1 Samuel 13, verse 14, that God sought out for himself a man after his own heart. David, though he erred, would eventually put his heart in line with God and what God wanted. Saul did not do that. And so the remainder of Saul's life bears witness to the sad truth. When Samuel confronted Saul for his failure to utterly destroy the Amalekites, for example, Saul blamed the people there in 1 Samuel 15. 1 Samuel 15, look verse 13. First Samuel came to Saul, and Saul said to him, "Blessed are you of the Lord, I have carried out the commandment of the Lord." And then you get over there to verse 20 in 1 Samuel 15. Then Saul said to Samuel, "I did obey the voice of the Lord, went on the mission on which the Lord sent me, and have brought back Agag, the king of Amalek, and have utterly destroyed the Amalekites." But then in verse 21, "But the people took some of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the choicest of the things devoted to destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God at Gilgal." And just read verse 22 as well. Samuel said, "Has the Lord as much delighted in burnt offerings and sacrifices as in obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed than the fat of rams. For rebellion is as the sin of divination, and insubordination is as iniquity and idolatry. Because you've rejected the word of the Lord, he has also rejected you from being king." So it's like, I did the commandment of the Lord. Look, I went and I fulfilled this and we defeated them. But the people that you gave me, almost kind of like Adam and Eve, right? The woman that you gave me. But the people that you gave me, they took some of the things. And when God wanted something destroyed, it is complete and utter destruction. It's not, you can't say, well, God's okay with me taking this because in the end, I'm going to use it to sacrifice to God, which is what they did. That isn't what God told you to do. And so Samuel reminds them that obedience is better than sacrifice. That God would much rather prefer you obey his commandments rather than trying to have some sacrifice that really you're making up on your own. And so that there's all of that there, and his confession later, it was really in verses 24 through 30, it was really void of any sincerity. And it was void of any sincerity, and we see that by Samuel's continued rebuke, by God's rejection of him, and his desire to be honored before Israel instead of honoring God by penitence and godly sorrow. Saul wanted to be honored and he wanted to be honored in front of all the people, instead of God being honored. God being first. You might remember, I think it was last week or maybe the week before the sermon, talking about serving others. I think it was last week. Serving others, but our service to God comes first. And so he ended up, because of this, filling his heart with envy and hatred for David, trying to kill him on numerous occasions. He tried to kill Jonathan, his own son. Just look over in 1 Samuel chapter 20. 1 Samuel chapter 20, verses 30 through 33. Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan. Now Jonathan is Saul's son, if you don't know. And he said to him, "You son of a perverse, rebellious woman." Blaming the wife, you know. "Do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness?" So choosing David. "For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now send and bring him to me, for he must surely die." But Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Then Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him down. So Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. So, and you know, there's the account that Jonathan then gets up and leaves the table and goes to warn David. So we have that, you know, Saul, he's talking to his son. And basically it's a matter of, I can't believe that you are choosing, you worthless ingrate, that you are choosing David. You're choosing someone else over your family. And if you're choosing David, then you're never going to be king. See, even then, Saul was not focused on what was right. It was a matter of, you're not going to be king. I will not be able to give over my kingdom to you if you're choosing David. And so Jonathan very simply asked the question, well, what has David done? What did he do to deserve this? And so, of course, you know, Saul does what any sane father would do, I suppose, and picks up a spear and throws it at his son to kill him. I mean, that's like an Old Testament whooping right there, you know. And so, you know, he had tried to kill him, tried to kill Jonathan. He slaughtered 85 priests and their families because they helped David. Look at chapter 22. Chapter 22, verses 11 through 19. Then the king sent someone to summon Amalek, the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's household, the priests who were in Nob, and all of them came to the king. Saul said, "Listen now, son of Ahitub." And he said, "Here I am, my lord." Saul then said to him, "Why have you and the son of Jesse, David, conspired against me, in that you have given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, so that he would rise up against me by lying in ambush, as it is this day?" Then Ahimelech answered the king and said, "And who among all your servants is as faithful as David? Even the king's son-in-law, who is captain over your guard, and is honored in your house. Did I just begin to inquire of God for him today? Far be it from me. Do not let the king impute anything to his servant, or to anyone, any of the household of my father, for your servant knows nothing at all about this affair." But the king said, "You shall surely die, Ahimelech, and you and all your father's household." And the king said to the guards who were attending him, "Turn around and put the priests of the Lord to death, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew that he was fleeing, did not reveal it to me." But the servants of the king were not willing to put forth their hands to attack the priests of the Lord. Then the king said to Doeg, "You turn around and attack the priests." And Doeg the Edomite turned around and attacked the priests, and killed that day 85 men who wore the linen ephod. And he struck not the city of priests with the edge of the sword, both men and women, children and infants, also oxen, donkeys, and sheep he struck with the edge of the sword. So Saul, so dead set against God, so enamored with himself, so prideful, would not submit to humility, would not repent of his sins. And so that causes him to be bitter against David and try to have David killed. It causes him to become bitter against his own son, try to have his own son killed. Causes him to invade this neighboring city and kill 85 of God's priests. Not only that, but then to go into the city and kill the rest of the men, women, and children and all of their animals. All for his own vengeance. Now, here's what's kind of interesting, I think at least. What he did then is what God wanted him to do for the Amalekites. God wanted him with the Amalekites to go in and completely destroy them. But instead, the people took some of the spoil so that they could, quote unquote, do their own little sacrifices later, something that God didn't want. But Saul didn't do that. It was for God, and he chose not to do that. And blames the people with him for it. But when it came to him, when it came to his vengeance, he went the extra mile and did what God had wanted him to do with the Amalekites. Does that make sense? When it came to Saul, he obliterated the city and everything in it. There were no, I'm going to take spoils and take them back to the treasury, or I'm going to make sacrifices to myself. It's kill them all, let God sort them out. But when it came to God, it was a whole other matter. And we might think of John the Immerser in the New Testament, who said what? I must decrease. He must increase. We come second. God comes first. It's always been that way. Always. And the only time it's ever caused a problem is when we switch the dynamic and we put ourselves first and God second. That's when it's always become a problem. Because we're going after what we want. The funny thing, that it's sad, really, ironic, I don't know, y'all pick the word, is that we can look at the church today, the way Christians act today, the way they conduct themselves in their relation to God today, and see all of it through the entire Bible. We wonder, what are we doing wrong? Right? We might say, what are we doing wrong? What have I done? How should I do this? How should I handle this? And all of these things. And yet, half the time, when we have those questions, we don't open up the manual. You know? We don't see, okay, well, how was this handled? Right? And to see those differences. He slaughtered 85 priests, their families, because they helped David, and he spent the whole of his 40-year reign with an indifference toward the Ark of the Covenant that symbolized God's presence with the nation. You might jot down 1 Chronicles chapter 13 and verse 3. 1 Chronicles 13 and verse 3. At the close of his rule, when it says, let me see here. 1 Samuel. Pages sticking together. At the close of his rule, 1 Samuel 28 and verse 6. When Saul inquired of the Lord did not answer him, either by dreams or by Urim or by prophets. And then in chapter 31, verses 3 through 6, this is a battle with the Philistines. The battle went heavily against Saul, and the archers hit him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, this is 1 Samuel 31 and now verse 4. Then Saul said to his armor bearer, draw your sword and pierce me through with it, otherwise these uncircumcised will come and pierce me through and make sport of me. But his armor bearer would not, for he was greatly afraid. So Saul took his sword and fell on it. When his armor bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell on his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died with his 3 sons, his armor bearer, and all his men on that day together. Not how it started out. You know, to imagine you're starting your reign and your first military victory, you thank God. You offer sacrifices to God, you're praising God, and then you have become so in love with yourself and so prideful, and you put God second for so long that in the end you go to God and God's not talking to you anymore. And then your life ends this way. Which ultimately is suicide, because his armor bearer is not going to kill him. You know, he propped up his sword in the dirt and he fell on his sword. That's what it is. It didn't have to end that way, though. Didn't have to. You know? So many times Christians, they'll you know, look at one mistake that they make in the journey, and they'll think, well, there's no way that God can save me, or I've gone too far, or what have you. And it's like, you haven't gone too far until you take your last breath. You know? The way you start is not the way you have to finish, and the way, and you know, you can start off bad, horrible, not knowing Christ, not caring about God or anything else, but it doesn't have to end that way. You know? At the same time, you could start off loving God, praising God like Saul did, and it not end that way. It's consistent. It's the journey and the destination. Saul violated every principle that Samuel stressed in his final speech to Israel, and lived and died at war with God and at war with himself. 1 Samuel chapters 10 through 31, that is the portrait of a man who never seriously thought about the nature of God, the nature of sin, and the principles of redemption. He had never thought about any of it. And we can liken that to a modern-day Christian who never prays, who never reads their Bible, who when they do wrong, it's, you know, God, I'm sorry, you know, I repent, and, you know, that's kind of the attitude of it, you know. And it's tragic, because if we want to be strong Christians, we have to spend more time with God and considering who God is and who we are and what's been done for us. Right? Any thoughts or comments?
What chapter did you just give? What and what?
Are you talking about his death or just his whole? If you're talking about kind of the scope of his life and reign, it's 1 Samuel 10 through 31.
Okay.
But if you're talking about his death, then that's 1 Samuel 31, verses 3 through 6.
Yeah.
No thoughts? Everybody away? Okay. So the book of 2 Samuel. 2 Samuel covers the 40-year reign of David over Israel. Initially, David's reign included only Judah. Civil war really characterizes the first 7.5 years of his rule with Abner and others. Saul's Ishbosheth is the other. Saul's son leading the tribes of Israel. Following the deaths of Abner and Ishbosheth, there in 2 Samuel chapter 5 and verse 3. 2 Samuel 5 and verse 3. All the elders of Israel came to the king of Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them before the Lord at Hebron. Then they anointed David king over Israel. So for about the first 7.5 years, it's civil war that has broken out. And really David is just responsible for Judah. Until after Abner's death and Ishbosheth's death, these elders come to David and they make him king over Israel. And in the early days of David's reign over all of Israel, he learned a lesson on 2 different occasions about the nature of God with regard to sovereignty and the principle of absolute authority. And that's foundation to man's relationship with God. We have to understand the sovereignty of God, and really that's kind of a series of lessons on its own. But in a nutshell, it is that God is in control of all things. God can do what He wants, when He wants, to whomever He wants, for whatever reason He wants. He is the ultimate authority. And as Paul would write in the New Testament, what right does the clay have to question the potter? We don't get to say, I mean, we can, but don't think you're always going to get an answer. But Paul is saying, what right do we have to say, God, why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? What right do you have to do this? What right do you have to do that? And so in the early days of David's reign, he learned a couple of lessons on that. And the first lesson came from really the ashes of human tragedy. David, he was transporting the Ark of the Covenant from the house of Abinadab to Jerusalem. And he completely disregarded God's plainly stated means of how to move that. We're not going to read it, but you just jot down Numbers chapter 4, verses 1 through 15. Numbers chapter 4, verses 1 through 15. That tells how they're supposed to transport the Ark of the Covenant. Okay? And it's on the shoulders of the people. They've got those long rods that are going through. It's to be on their shoulders and what have you. And on the shoulders of the Kohathites. So the responsibilities of some of these others, the Gershonites and the Merarites, in moving the tabernacle, that involved oxen and wagons. Okay? Let's see here. So David, he substituted a wagon and oxen for God's specified means of moving the ark. We're not going to carry. You're not going to carry it on your shoulders. Instead, we'll put it on a wagon. Oxen will carry it. You'll be okay. You won't hurt your lower back and all that type of stuff, right? But then an oxen stumbled. And, so the wagon kind of stumbles a little bit. The ark's about to fall off, right? And Uzzah does what? Reaches out, touches the ark. He's trying to stabilize it. He's not thinking he's doing anything wrong. He doesn't want the ark to fall, the tablets to fall out, and the manna that's in there, and the sprouted rod of Aaron. And so he reaches out and touches the ark. And in 2 Samuel chapter 6 and verse 7, the anger of the Lord burned against Uzzah, and God struck him down right there for his irreverence, and he died there by the ark of God. Now imagine how quick that happens. Going along, stumbles, reach out, touch, dead. That's how quick judgment comes. he wasn't trying to be irreverent. I mean, he's trying to protect the ark. He doesn't want it stumbling over and what have you. But part of it comes down to this, and in emotion, David, he actually viewed God's righteous act as going beyond the bounds of justice. He didn't think it was just.
I find it very interesting that in verse 9, as far as I know, is set in verse that David was afraid of the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's not something that I would have ever thought, that David had an emotion like that. But
Yeah.
he did. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and you look at verse 8, there's that he became angry because of the Lord's outburst against Uzzah. And so he was afraid of God. You know? And even David's not thinking really at this point. I mean, he might be thinking, what did he do? What did Uzzah do? I mean, it was going to stumble. He reached out. He was trying to stabilize it. What did he do wrong? You know, or another option might be is that David knew why Uzzah died and realizes that ultimately it was David's fault.
Yeah.
That's got to put a weight on somebody. That this person died because of a decision that I made. And how is this going to work out? I'm afraid of doing anything against God. But he acknowledged that his failure was his own. In 1 Chronicles 15 and verse 13, it says, we sought him not after the due order. So the difference in carrying it on the shoulders and the oxen and wagons, it's the difference in obedience and disobedience. 15:13. That's the difference. It's not a matter. It's not a difference between it being on the shoulders and it being on a wagon pulled by oxen. That's not the difference. The difference is between obedience and disobedience. You know, it's the difference between walking by faith and walking by feeling. Submitting to God's will or bringing in our own self-will. That's the difference. Respecting divine authority or paying more attention to human authority. So that's the first lesson. We'll go ahead, since time's up, we'll end it there. We'll pick up with the second lesson next week. But did anybody have any closing thoughts or comments? Okie dokie then. Well, I thank y'all very much for your kind attention.